The gravel road leading to Millfield, Oregon, stretched like a dusty ribbon through endless Douglas fir forests, disappearing into morning fog that clung to the valley like cigarette smoke in a diner booth. It was October 15th, 1969, and the small logging town of barely 800 souls was preparing for another day that would begin like any other, but end in a way that would haunt 3 generations. 26-year-old Tommy Brennan, adjusted his flannel shirt collar against the autumn chill as he walked down Maple Street toward Henderson's general store. His work boots, still caked with sawdust from yesterday's shift at the mill, left imprints on the wooden sidewalk that ran the length of the town's main drag. The sound echoed off the storefronts, Peterson's barber shop, with its spinning red and white pole, Murphy's diner where the coffee was always too strong and the pie always too good, and the Millfield post office where Mrs. Caldwell had been sorting mail for longer than most folks could remember. Tommy carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. His dark hair was combed back in the style that was slowly giving way to the longer cuts the younger mill workers had started wearing, influenced by what they saw on television when the reception was clear enough. His face bore the honest lines of someone who worked with his hands, and his brown eyes held the kind of steady warmth that made children wave at him from their front porches and elderly neighbors stop to ask about his mother's health. The bell above Henderson's door chimed as Tommy pushed inside, breathing in the familiar mixture of coffee, tobacco, and the faint scent of the penny candy that filled 3 large glass jars on the counter. Old Pete Henderson looked up from his newspaper. The front page carried stories about Vietnam and the ongoing moon landing celebration, and nodded at his regular customer. "Morning, Tommy. The usual. You know it. Pack of Lucky Strikes and whatever MRs. Henderson's got brewing back there that smells like heaven." Pete's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, pulling the cigarettes from the rack and pouring steaming coffee into a paper cup. "Eleanor's trying some new blend she ordered from Portland. Says it's what they're drinking in the big city these days." Tommy counted out exact change from his wallet, a worn brown leather piece that his father had carried before him. "Well, if it's good enough for the city folks, I reckon it's good enough for us country boys." The 2 men shared the comfortable laugh of neighbors who'd known each other for years. Through the store's front window, Tommy could see the morning shift workers beginning their walk toward the Cascade lumber mill. The mill's whistle would blow in 30 minutes, and the sound would carry across the entire valley, a daily reminder of what kept Millfield alive. Tommy had been working at Cascade for 8 years, ever since he'd graduated from Millfield High School and decided that college wasn't for him. The work was honest and paid well enough to help support his mother, Dorothy, who lived alone in the small white house on Pine Street where Tommy had grown up. His father, Robert Brennan, had died in a logging accident when Tommy was 16, leaving behind a family that learned to lean on each other and a community that never forgot to check on the widow Brennan and her boy. "You heading to the mill soon?" Pete asked, though he already knew the answer. Routines in Millfield were as predictable as the sunrise. "In a bit. Promised Ma I'd stop by and fix that loose board on her front porch before work. She's been after me about it for 2 weeks now." Pete chuckled. "Smart woman, your mother. Knows how to get things done." Single quotes. Tommy sipped his coffee and grimaced slightly. "Eleanor might want to stick with the old blend." "Pete, this stuff tastes like it could strip paint." "I'll pass that along," Pete said, making a note on a small pad beside the register. "She's been experimenting with all sorts of things lately. Last week it was some kind of herbal tea that smelled like my grandmother's medicine cabinet." The bell chimed again as Sarah McKenna entered the store, her auburn hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes bright with the energy of someone who'd been up before dawn. Sarah worked as a secretary at the mill's main office, and at 24, she was one of the few unmarried women in Millfield who seemed in no hurry to change that status. "Morning, Pete." "Morning, Tommy." Her smile was warm but professional, the kind that said she was friendly without being forward. "Sarah," Tommy nodded, feeling the familiar flutter in his chest that had been occurring more frequently whenever she was around. "You're here early today. Mr. Caldwell wants me to get the payroll sorted before the morning shift starts." Apparently, there was some confusion with the hours last week. She moved toward the counter, where Pete was already reaching for her usual order, a small black coffee and a apple Danish. Tommy lingered. ostensibly reading the headlines on the newspaper rack, but actually stealing glances at Sarah as she counted out her coins. He'd been working up the courage to ask her to the harvest dance at the community center for 3 weeks now. But something always seemed to interrupt the moment. "You two going to the dance this Saturday?" Pete asked, as if reading Tommy's mind. Sarah's cheeks colored slightly. "I'm thinking about it. Mrs. Patterson's been, after all, the single folks to show up. Says it's good for community morale. It should be fun," Tommy said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "The Peterson boys got themselves a proper band this year. Drove all the way to Eugene to hire them." "Well then," Sarah said, gathering her breakfast, "I suppose I'll have to make sure my dancing shoes still fit." She headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at Tommy. "Maybe I'll see you there." Tommy's grin was answer enough. "Yes, ma'am. I'll save you a dance." After Sarah left, Pete shook his head with amusement. "Boy, you've been circling that girl like a hawk for months. Why don't you just ask her properly? These things take time, Pete. Can't rush matters of the heart." "Matters of the heart, he says," Pete muttered, returning to his newspaper. "At this rate, you'll both be collecting Social Security before you work up the nerve." Tommy finished his coffee and stubbed out the cigarette he'd lit while talking to Sarah. The mill whistle would blow soon, and he wanted to stop by his mother's house first. He left Henderson's with a wave and headed down Maple Street toward Pine, his step a little lighter after the encounter with Sarah. Dorothy Brennan was waiting on her front porch when Tommy arrived, a cup of tea steaming in her hands and a look of mild exasperation on her face. At 53, she was still a handsome woman, though the years since her husband's death had added lines around her eyes and streaks of silver to her brown hair. "Thomas Patrick Brennan, that board has been loose for 3 weeks. I nearly fell through it yesterday while watering my geranium." Tommy kissed his mother's cheek and knelt down to examine the offending board. "Sorry, Ma. I keep meaning to get to it, but work's been keeping me busy. Work's been keeping you busy for 8 years. And somehow I managed to raise you and keep this house standing before you started using that excuse." Tommy pulled a hammer from the toolbox he kept on his mother's back porch and made quick work of the repair. The sound of hammer on nail carried across the quiet neighborhood, where most of the houses showed the same careful maintenance that came from people who understood the value of what they owned. "There," he said, testing the board with his weight. "Solid as the day it was built." Dorothy smiled and ruffled her son's hair the way she had when he was 12. "You're a good boy, Tommy. Your father would be proud." The mill whistle blew, its long piercing note echoing across the valley. Tommy gathered his tools and gave his mother another quick kiss. "I'll stop by after work. Maybe we can listen to that new radio program you've been wanting to try. The one about the detective. I'd like that. Be careful at the mill today, son." Tommy was halfway down the front walk when his mother called after him. "Tommy, don't forget about the dance Saturday. Sarah McInnes been asking Mrs. Patterson about you." Tommy's face reddened, but he was smiling as he hurried toward the mill. The walk took him past the heart of Millfield, the white-steepled Methodist church, where the Brennan family had attended services for 3 generations, the volunteer fire department, where Tommy spent 2 evenings a month, and the small park, where children played on swings that had been installed by their grandfathers. The Cascade lumber mill sat at the edge of town like a sleeping giant, its massive buildings and towering smokestacks a testament to the industry that had carved Millfield out of the Oregon wilderness. The parking lot was already full of pickup trucks and family sedans, their paint dulled by sawdust and their beds loaded with lunch pails and thermoses. Tommy joined the stream of workers heading toward the main gate, exchanging morning greetings with men he'd known since childhood. There was Frank Morrison, whose family had run Morrison's Hardware for 40 years. Big Jim Sullivan, whose wife made the best apple pies in 3 counties. Young Danny Peterson, barely 18, and eager to prove himself among the older workers. The mill operated with the precision of a well-wound clock. Each man knew his role, his schedule, his responsibilities. Tommy worked the main cutting floor, where massive logs were transformed into lumber, with machinery that demanded both skill and respect. The work was dangerous. Every man carried scars from blades that moved faster than thought, but it was honest work that paid an honest wage. By lunchtime, Tommy had settled into the familiar rhythm of the mill. The whine of the saws, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the satisfaction of seeing raw timber become something useful. It all combined to create a sense of purpose that Tommy had never questioned. This was his place, these were his people, and this was the life he'd chosen. He ate his lunch, ham sandwich, apple, and coffee from a thermos his mother had packed, sitting on a stack of lumber outside the main building. The October air was crisp, but not yet cold, and the autumn light filtered through the trees in a way that made everything look like a painting. "You heading to the harvest dance Saturday?" Danny Peterson asked, joining Tommy with his own lunch pail. "Planning on it. You wouldn't miss it." Mary Louise Fletcher's been dropping hints the size of Oregon about wanting to go. "Figure I better ask her before someone else does." Tommy smiled at the young man's nervousness. "Good thinking. The Peterson boys don't let grass grow under their feet when it comes to matters of the heart. Speaking of which, you ever going to ask Sarah McKenna to dance? Or are you planning to admire her from across the room for another year?" "I'm working on it," Tommy said, though he could hear the defensive tone in his own voice. The afternoon shift passed without incident. Tommy worked alongside men who'd taught him everything he knew about lumber, about work, about being part of something larger than himself. When the final whistle blew at 5 o'clock, he was tired in the satisfying way that came from a day of productive labor. He walked home through streets that were beginning to show the first signs of evening. Porch lights flickered on, and the smell of dinner cooking drifted from kitchen windows. Children played in front yards while mothers called them in to wash up. It was a scene that had played out in Millfield for decades, and Tommy felt the deep contentment that came from being part of something stable and good. He stopped at Henderson's again to buy cigarettes for the evening, and found Pete closing out the register. "Good day at the mill. Same as always. Steady work, steady pay. That's all a man can ask for," Pete agreed. "You have plans for tonight?" "Promised Ma I'd listen to her radio program with her. Then maybe I'll work on my truck a bit. She's been making some noises that don't sound quite right." Tommy's truck was a 1961 Ford pickup that he'd bought used and had been slowly restoring in his spare time. It was parked outside his small apartment above Kellerman's garage, where he'd lived since turning 21 and deciding it was time to give his mother some space. The apartment was small but comfortable. A bedroom, a sitting room with a kitchenette, and a bathroom he shared with the tenant across the hall. Tommy had furnished it with pieces from the church's charity sales and items his mother couldn't bear to throw away, but no longer had room for. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that mattered. He changed out of his work clothes and walked the 6 blocks to his mother's house, enjoying the evening air and the familiar sights of his neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson was working in her garden, pulling up the last of her summer vegetables. Mr. Kellerman was underneath someone's car in his driveway, his legs sticking out comically while he worked. The Morrison children were playing tag in their front yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Dorothy had dinner waiting, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, green beans from her garden, and fresh bread that filled the small kitchen with warmth. They ate slowly, talking about the mill, the upcoming dance, and the small happenings that made up the fabric of life in Millfield. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by this afternoon," Dorothy said as they cleared the dishes. "She wanted to make sure you knew about the dance. Said Sarah McKenna had been asking about the music." Tommy felt his face grow warm. "Ma, you didn't. I didn't say anything improper, if that's what you're worried about. Just told her that my son was looking forward to the evening." After dinner, they settled in the living room to listen to Dorothy's new radio program, a mystery series about a private detective in San Francisco. The radio, a large wooden zenith that had been a wedding present to Tommy's parents, filled the room with crackling voices and dramatic music. Tommy found himself only half listening to the story. His mind kept wandering to Saturday night, to the possibility of dancing with Sarah, to the future that seemed to be taking shape in small, comfortable pieces. The mill work, the apartment, the truck, the girl. It all felt like the beginning of something real and lasting. When the program ended, he kissed his mother goodnight and walked back to his apartment under a sky full of stars. The air was getting colder, and he could smell the distant scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Tomorrow would bring another day at the mill, another step toward the dance, another piece of the life he was building in the place where he'd always belonged. Tommy Brennan fell asleep that night with the windows cracked open, listening to the familiar sounds of Millfield settling into evening, a dog barking in the distance, the rumble of a late truck on the highway, the whistle of the night freight train that carried lumber to markets in Portland and beyond. He had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, his name would be spoken in worried whispers throughout the town, that search parties would form and dissolve without finding a trace, that his mother would wait by the telephone for calls that would never come. October 16, 1969, dawned grey and misty. The kind of morning that made the mountains disappear and turned Millfield into an island floating in a sea of fog. Tommy's alarm clock buzzed at 6:30, the same time it had buzzed every working day for 8 years. But this morning, something was different. Mrs. Kellerman, who lived below Tommy's apartment, would later tell the police that she heard him moving around upstairs at the usual time. She heard the shower running, heard his work boots on the wooden floor, heard the radio playing the morning news as he got ready for work. But when Frank Morrison stopped by Henderson's store at 7:15 and asked Pete if he'd seen Tommy that morning, Pete shook his head. "Haven't seen him yet. But you know Tommy, punctual as a Swiss watch. He'll be along by 7:30, when Tommy usually arrived at the mill for the 8 o'clock shift. His usual spot in the parking lot remained empty. Frank Morrison, who had given Tommy rides to work when his truck was being repaired, drove by the apartment above Kellerman's garage and saw the 1961 Ford pickup parked in its usual spot. At 8 o'clock, when the mill whistle blew and Tommy's position on the cutting floor remained vacant, his supervisor, Walt Harrison, made a note in his ledger and figured the young man was fighting off a cold. It happened to everyone eventually. But when noon came and went without word, Walt began to worry. Tommy Brennan had never missed a day of work without calling in. Never missed a day of work, period, unless his mother was sick or there was a death in the family. At 12:15, Walt Harrison picked up the telephone in the mill office and dialed the number for Kellerman's garage. "Lou, Walt Harrison at the mill. Is Tommy Brennan feeling poorly today? He didn't show up for his shift." Lou Kellerman's voice carried the confusion that would soon spread throughout Millfield, like ripples in a pond. "Walt, I saw Tommy's truck here this morning, same as always, but I haven't seen Tommy himself. You want me to go up and knock on his door? Would you mind? I just want to make sure the boy's all right." Lou Kellerman climbed the wooden stairs to Tommy's apartment and knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and called out Tommy's name. Still nothing. The landlord had a key, and after some discussion with Walt Harrison and Frank Morrison, who had driven over from the mill, they decided to use it. Tommy's apartment was exactly as he'd left it that morning, or so it appeared. The bed was made with military precision, the way his mother had taught him. His work clothes from the previous day were folded neatly on a chair. The coffee pot was clean and empty. The bathroom showed signs of recent use. A damp towel, the faint scent of soap and shaving cream. But Tommy Brennan was nowhere to be found. His wallet sat on the kitchen table, containing $18 and his driver's license. His keys hung on a small hook beside the door. His work boots were gone, as was his jacket and lunch pail. Lou Kellerman scratched his head and looked around the small apartment one more time. Looks like he got ready for work, same as always. But where the hell did he go? The news of Tommy Brennan's disappearance spread through Millfield like smoke from a forest fire. Slow at first, then everywhere at once. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Dorothy Brennan sat in her kitchen, surrounded by neighbors who spoke in hushed tones while she stared at the telephone, willing it to ring with news of her son. Sheriff Daniel Hayes arrived at Kellerman's garage in his green and white patrol car, the gravel crunching under his tires as he pulled up beside Tommy's pickup truck. Hayes was a methodical man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the careful demeanor of someone who'd seen enough of small-town troubles to know that most missing persons cases ended with embarrassed explanations rather than tragedy. "Lou, walk me through this again," Hayes said, pulling a small notebook from his shirt pocket. "When exactly did you last see Tommy?" Lou Kellerman shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands stained with motor oil, and his face creased with worry. "Yesterday evening, around 6:30, he came home from the mill, went upstairs to his place. I heard him moving around up there, heard his radio playing. Nothing unusual. And this morning, that's where it gets strange, Sheriff. I heard him getting ready for work. Shower running, boots on the floor, radio on with the morning news, but I never actually saw him leave the building." Hayes examined Tommy's pickup truck, noting that it was locked and showed no signs of disturbance. The interior was neat and clean, with a thermos on the seat and work gloves in the glove compartment. He made notes about the vehicle's condition and location, following procedures he'd learned during his 23 years in law enforcement. His supervisor at the mill says Tommy never missed work without calling. Hayes continued. "Walt Harrison's been there 15 years, says Tommy's the most reliable man on his crew." Frank Morrison approached the group gathered around the truck, his face drawn with concern. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about this all afternoon. Tommy was supposed to meet me at Henderson's this morning. We always grab coffee together before the shift. When he didn't show up, I figured he was running late. Did he mention any plans? Anywhere he might have gone? Nothing special. He was excited about the harvest dance Saturday night. Been working up the courage to ask Sarah McKenna properly. Frank paused, realizing how normal it all sounded. Tommy's not the type to just disappear, Sheriff. Something's not right here. By evening, word had reached every household in Millfield. The women organized around Dorothy Brennan's kitchen table, bringing casseroles and coffee, while the men gathered in small groups to discuss search strategy. The volunteer fire department agreed to coordinate search efforts, and by sunset, 37 men had volunteered to begin looking for Tommy at first light. Sarah McKenna arrived at Dorothy's house, carrying a covered dish and eyes red from crying. She'd heard the news at the mill office and had been unable to concentrate on her work for the rest of the day. "Mrs. Brennan," she said softly, placing the dish on the crowded kitchen counter. "I'm so sorry. I know Tommy will be found safe." Dorothy took Sarah's hands in hers, noting how young and frightened the girl looked. "He spoke of you often, dear. He was planning to ask you to the dance." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I was hoping he would." The first organized search began at dawn on October 17. Sheriff Hayes divided the volunteers into teams, assigning each group a section of the vast forest that surrounded Millfield. The men carried compass bearings and maps, marked with logging roads, creek beds, and hunting trails that crisscrossed the wilderness in patterns known only to locals. Big Jim Sullivan led a team along Miller Creek, following the water downstream toward the Columbia River. Frank Morrison and Danny Peterson searched the old logging roads that wound through the hills east of town. Walt Harrison took his group to the abandoned mining claims that dotted the mountainsides, remnants of the gold rush that had brought the first settlers to the region. For 3 days, the search continued. Men called Tommy's name until their voices were hoarse, examined every cabin and shed within a 10-mile radius, and followed every deer trail that might have attracted a man taking an unexpected walk. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign that Tommy Brennan had ever walked those woods. On the 4th day, Sheriff Hayes made the decision to expand the search. He contacted the state police and requested assistance from their search and rescue team. 2 bloodhounds arrived from Salem, along with a team of experienced trackers who specialized in finding missing persons in wilderness areas. The dogs were given items from Tommy's apartment, a work shirt, a pair of socks, his pillow. They picked up his scent immediately in the apartment, followed it down the stairs, and out to the parking area, where his truck was parked. But then the trail went cold, as if Tommy had simply vanished into thin air. Could someone have picked him up? Hayes asked the lead tracker, a weathered man named Carl Hendricks, who'd been finding lost people for 20 years. "It's possible," Hendricks replied, studying his notes. "But usually we find at least some indication of direction. Scuff marks on the gravel, maybe a cigarette, but if he was waiting for a ride, there's nothing here, Sheriff. It's like he walked out of that apartment and disappeared." As the days turned into weeks, the organized search efforts gradually diminished. The volunteers returned to their jobs and families, though many continued to look for signs of Tommy during their daily routines. Every hunter who entered the woods carried Tommy's description. Every fisherman who worked the streams kept an eye out for anything unusual. Dorothy Brennan's house became an unofficial headquarters for information about the search. People stopped by daily to check for news, to offer help, to simply sit with a mother whose son had vanished without explanation. The kitchen table was always set for visitors, and the coffee pot never seemed too empty. "Someone must know something," Dorothy would say, staring out her window toward the mountains that surrounded their valley. "People don't just disappear. Not in a place like this." Sheriff Hayes continued his investigation, methodically checking every possibility his experience suggested. He interviewed Tommy's co-workers, his neighbors, his friends. He contacted bus stations in Eugene and Portland, checked with the Army recruitment office in case Tommy had decided to enlist without telling anyone. He even called hospitals as far away as Seattle, thinking perhaps Tommy had been injured and was suffering from amnesia. Every lead nowhere. 3 weeks after Tommy's disappearance, Hayes sat in his office reviewing the case file that had grown frustratingly thin. Missing person reports, search grid maps, interview notes, and photographs of Tommy's apartment and truck. The physical evidence could fit in a single manila folder, and none of it explained what had happened to a 26-year-old man who had never shown any inclination to leave Millfield. "Any ideas?" asked Deputy Robert Clark, Hayes's only full-time assistant, and a young man who'd grown up in Millfield and known Tommy since childhood. None that makes sense, Hayes replied. Tommy had $18 in his wallet, which rules out robbery. No girlfriend troubles. If anything, he was more interested in dating than usual. No debts, no enemies, no reason to disappear voluntarily. What about his truck? If he didn't drive away, someone else must have given him a ride. But where? And why? The bus doesn't stop in Millfield, and the nearest train station is 30 miles away in Oakridge. Who would Tommy trust enough to get in their car at 7 in the morning without telling anyone where he was going? As autumn deepened into winter, the case of Tommy Brennan's disappearance settled into the background of daily life in Millfield. His name was still mentioned in conversations, his absence still felt at the mill and in the community, but the urgent sense of crisis gradually faded into a persistent ache that touched everyone who had known him. Dorothy Brennan continued her routine, but the life seemed to have gone out of them. She still attended church every Sunday, still worked in her garden, still invited neighbors over for coffee. But those who knew her best could see the changes, the way she would pause in the middle of conversations, the way her eyes would drift toward the window when someone knocked on the door, the way she would set 2 cups on the table before remembering that Tommy would not be joining her. Sarah McKenna requested a transfer to the mill's office in Eugene, citing family reasons. Everyone understood that the sight of Tommy's empty workspace had become too painful to bear. She left Millfield just before Thanksgiving, and her departure felt like another small death in a community that was still grieving the first. The harvest dance was cancelled that year, the first time in living memory that the community had let the tradition lapse. Mrs. Patterson, who had organized the event for 15 years, said it didn't feel right to celebrate when one of their own was missing. Winter in Millfield brought snow that blanketed the mountains and turned the logging roads into impassable tracks. The search for Tommy was suspended until spring, though Sheriff Hayes continued to follow up on occasional reports of sighting. A hitchhiker near Portland who might have been Tommy, a man matching his description seen at a bus station in Sacramento, a logger in Washington who looked familiar to someone passing through. None of the leads panned out. Christmas came and went with a subdued quality that even the children seemed to sense. The usual community celebrations felt forced, and many families found themselves gathered around dinner tables, where Tommy's absence was felt as strongly as if there had been an empty chair at every meal. By spring of 1970, Sheriff Hayes had exhausted every conventional avenue of investigation. The state police had officially classified Tommy Brennan as a missing person, and his case file had been sent to regional agencies across the Pacific Northwest. His photograph appeared on bulletin boards in police stations from California to Washington. But the responses were always the same. No one had seen him. No one knew anything about his disappearance. The mill replaced Tommy on the cutting crew with a young man from Eugene who worked hard but never quite fit into the rhythms of the operation the way Tommy had. His apartment above Kellerman's garage was rented to a traveling salesman who was rarely in town and never seemed to notice the way. Lou Kellerman still looked up at the windows when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Frank Morrison took over Tommy's volunteer duties at the fire department, but no one called him by name during emergency call. He was simply the man who replaced Tommy, as if acknowledging the substitution to directly would make the loss more real. As 1970 turned into 1971, and then 1972, Tommy Brennan's disappearance became part of Millfield's folklore. New residents heard the story from their neighbors, often accompanied by speculation about what might have happened. Some theorized that Tommy had decided to start over somewhere else, perhaps influenced by the changing times and the youth movement that was reshaping American culture. Others suggested darker possibilities, that he had encountered someone dangerous in the woods, or had been the victim of foul play that had been carefully concealed. But those who had known Tommy best rejected such explanations. Tommy Brennan was not the type to abandon his mother and his responsibilities. He was not adventurous enough to seek radical change, nor was he troubled enough to contemplate self-harm. He was, by all accounts, a man who had found contentment in a simple life, and had every reason to continue living it. The mystery deepened with each passing year, becoming more puzzling rather than less so. If Tommy had been killed, where was his body? If he had left voluntarily, why had he taken nothing with him and never contacted his mother? If he had been kidnapped, why had no ransom demand ever been made? Sheriff Hayes retired in 1975, having never solved the case that had haunted the final years of his career. His replacement, a younger man named Michael Torres, who had trained with the state police, reviewed the Brennan file thoroughly, but found no new avenues to explore. The trail, such as it had ever existed, had gone completely cold. Dorothy Brennan aged visibly during those years, her brown hair turning completely grey, and her face taking on the drawn look of someone who carried a constant burden of worry. She never moved from the house on Pine Street, telling friends that she wanted to be there if Tommy ever came home. She kept his room exactly as he had left it, dusting the furniture weekly and changing the sheets monthly, as if preparing for a return that everyone else had stopped expecting. On quiet evenings, neighbors would see her sitting on her front porch, her eyes scanning the street as if watching for a familiar figure to emerge from the gathering darkness. Children who had been born after Tommy's disappearance learned to wave at the sad lady on Pine Street, though they didn't understand why she always seemed to be waiting for something that never came. By the late 1970s, Millfield itself was changing. The lumber industry that had sustained the town for decades was facing new challenges from environmental regulations and foreign competition. Young people were leaving for opportunities in larger cities, and many of the families who had lived in the valley for generations were beginning to question whether their children would ever return. The volunteer fire department struggled to maintain membership as the population declined. Henderson's General Store was sold to a chain company that changed the inventory and the atmosphere, installing fluorescent lights and prepackaged food that tasted nothing like Eleanor Henderson's home cooking. Murphy's Diner closed when its owner retired, and no one stepped forward to take it over. Tommy Brennan's disappearance became a symbol of all that Millfield was losing: the certainty of community, the belief that neighbors looked after neighbors, the faith that some questions would eventually be answered. His case represented not just one missing man, but the erosion of a way of life that had seemed permanent and unshakable. In 1979, exactly 10 years after Tommy vanished, Dorothy Brennan placed a small memorial advertisement in the regional newspaper. It read simply, "Thomas Brennan, beloved son, disappeared October 16, 1969. Still loved, still missed, still hoped for." The responses she received surprised her. Letters came from across Oregon and beyond, from families who had experienced similar losses, and from strangers who had been touched by the story of the young man who had simply walked out of his life and never returned. Many of the letters contained their own stories of mysterious disappearances, of loved ones who had vanished without explanation, of communities that had searched and wondered and never found answers. Dorothy realized that Tommy's story was not unique, that across the country there were mothers like herself who waited by telephones that never rang and watched for faces that never appeared. The knowledge that others shared her pain provided little comfort, but it helped her understand that some mysteries were beyond human comprehension, that some questions were destined to remain unanswered. As the 1980s began, Sheriff Torres made one final attempt to generate new leads in the Brennan case. He arranged for Tommy's photograph and story to be featured on a television program that specialized in unsolved mysteries. The broadcast reached millions of viewers across the Pacific Northwest and generated dozens of tips and potential sightings. For 6 months, Torres and his deputies followed up on every lead. They interviewed people who claimed to have seen Tommy in places as distant as Alaska and Mexico. They investigated reports of unmarked graves and unidentified remains. They chased down stories of drifters and vagrants who might have matched Tommy's description. Once again, nothing came of the investigation. The television appearance did accomplish one thing. It ensured that Tommy Brennan's story would not be forgotten. The broadcast was later included in compilation programs about unsolved disappearances, and over the years, Tommy's photograph became familiar to viewers who had never heard of Millfield, Oregon. But familiarity did not bring answers, and publicity did not bring closure. 21 years had passed since Tommy Brennan walked out of his apartment and into the Oregon morning mist, never to be seen again. Millfield, in 1990, bore little resemblance to the thriving logging town it had been in. 1969, the Cascade lumber mill had closed 3 years earlier, its massive buildings standing empty like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Main Street showed gaps where businesses had once flourished. Henderson's General Store was now a discount outlet run by strangers, and half the storefronts displayed for lease signs that had grown, faded, and weathered. Dorothy Brennan was 74 now, her hair white as fresh snow, and her movements slowed by arthritis and the accumulated weight of 2 decades of waiting. She still lived in the house on Pine Street, though friends and neighbors had long since stopped suggesting she might want to move somewhere smaller. somewhere that didn't hold so many memories of the son who had never come home. The house itself showed the gentle decay of a place maintained by someone who no longer saw the point in fresh paint or new fixtures. The front porch where Tommy had fixed that loose board sagged slightly, and the garden that Dorothy had once tended with such care now grew wild around the edges, as if nature was slowly reclaiming what human hands had struggled to maintain. It was Sarah McKenna who brought the news that would change everything, though she was Sarah Chen now. Having married an engineer from Portland and raised 3 children in a suburb where the streets had names like Maple Lane and Oak Ridge Drive, she had returned to Millfield for the funeral of her aunt, the last of her family to remain in the dying town, and had decided to visit Dorothy Brennan before driving back to her life in the city. "Mrs. Brennan," Sarah said, settling into the familiar kitchen chair where she had sat so many times as a young woman. "I heard about the mill property being sold." Dorothy nodded slowly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown cold while they talked. "Some development company from California. They want to tear down the buildings and put in vacation homes for people from Portland. It's hard to imagine this place full of strangers. Everything changes, dear. Even the things we think will last forever." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 women separated by decades and life experiences, but connected by the memory of a young man who had loved them both in different ways. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows and sent leaves skittering across the yard, where Tommy had once played as a child. "Mrs. Brennan," Sarah said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I probably should have told you years ago." Dorothy's attention sharpened, and for a moment she looked like the younger woman who had waited by the telephone for news that never came. "What is it, dear?" "The day before Tommy disappeared, he came to see me at the mill office. It was after work, maybe 5:30 or 6 o'clock. Everyone else had gone home." Sarah paused, her fingers working at the handle of her coffee cup. Even after all these years, the memory carried weight. "He asked me to the harvest dance, just like we all thought he would. But there was something else, Mrs. Brennan. Something that didn't seem important at the time. But I've thought about it so many times over the years." Dorothy leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Sarah's face, with an intensity that made the younger woman suddenly understand how desperately this old woman had hungered for any scrap of information about her son's final days. "He told me he'd seen something that troubled him, something at the mill that didn't seem right. When I asked him what he meant, he said it was probably nothing, but that he was going to ask Walt Harrison about it the next day. What kind of something? He wouldn't say exactly. Just that there were trucks coming and going at odd hours, and that some of the lumber tallies didn't match what he was seeing on the cutting floor. He said it might be nothing, but it bothered him because the numbers never lied before." Dorothy absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that might finally fit somewhere in the vast emptiness of her son's disappearance. "Why didn't you tell Sheriff Hayes at the time?" Sarah's face flushed with shame that had lasted 2 decades. "Because I thought it was just Tommy being thorough, the way he always was about his work. And then, when he disappeared, everyone was so focused on the search, on finding him in the woods or the river. It seemed impossible that whatever he'd seen at the mill could be connected to him vanishing without a trace. And later, I was young and scared and living in Eugene. I told myself that if it was important, someone else would have noticed. I told myself that the police knew what they were doing, that they would find the truth without any help from me." Dorothy reached across the table and took Sarah's hand, feeling the soft skin of a woman who had spent her adult years working in offices rather than washing dishes and tending gardens. "You were just a girl, dear. No one could have known." But even as she spoke the words of forgiveness, Dorothy felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. After 2 decades of silence, here was a new piece of information, a thread that might lead somewhere other than the dead ends that had defined Tommy's case for so long. That evening, after Sarah had driven back to Portland with promises to stay in touch, Dorothy sat in her living room with a telephone book and placed a call to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Torres had retired 5 years earlier, but his replacement, a competent woman named Janet Morrison, who had grown up in Millfield and remembered Tommy's disappearance from her childhood, listened carefully to Dorothy's account of Sarah's revelation. "Mrs. Brennan, I'll look into this, but you have to understand that after 21 years, the chances of finding any records from the mill, I understand, Sheriff. But it's something, isn't it? It's more than we've had in all these years. Sheriff Morrison was true to her word. The next morning, she drove out to the abandoned mill property and walked through the empty buildings with a flashlight and a sense of futility. The offices had been cleared out years ago, when the mill closed, and any records that might have shed light on Tommy's concerns had long since been destroyed or lost. But sometimes persistence pays dividends in unexpected ways. Morrison was preparing to leave when she noticed that one of the office buildings had a basement level that wasn't immediately obvious from the outside. The door was locked, but the wood around the hinges had rotted enough that a firm push opened it easily. The basement was filled with the detritus of a business that had simply stopped operating one day and never bothered to clean up properly. Old filing cabinets, broken office furniture, boxes of papers that had been damaged by years of moisture and neglect. Morrison spent 2 hours picking through the mess, finding nothing but invoices for spare parts and correspondence about lumber orders that meant nothing to anyone anymore. She was about to give up when she noticed a metal filing cabinet pushed into a corner behind a broken desk. Unlike the other furniture, this cabinet was locked, and the lock looked newer than everything else in the room. Morrison called for a locksmith and waited, hoping that whatever was inside would justify the expense and effort. The cabinet contained personnel files dating back to the 1960s, including Tommy Brennan's employment record. But more importantly, it contained a folder labeled Night Operations 1969 that had been filed separately from the regular business record. Morrison spread the contents of the folder across the dusty surface of the broken desk, using her flashlight to read documents that hadn't been seen by human eyes in more than 20 years. What she found made her understand why Tommy Brennan had been troubled by what he'd observed at the mill. According to the records, the Cascade Lumber Mill had been selling lumber off the books during 1969, conducting transactions that weren't recorded in the official company ledgers. Trucks had been arriving after hours to pick up loads that had no corresponding paperwork, and the proceeds from these sales had been deposited into accounts that didn't appear on any of the mill's financial statements. The operation had been run by Walt Harrison, Tommy's supervisor, in partnership with 2 men whose names Morrison didn't recognize. The records showed that the scheme had been generating substantial profits, with each of the 3 partners receiving regular payments that far exceeded their official salaries. But the most shocking discovery was a handwritten note dated October 15th, 1969, the day before Tammy disappeared. The note, written in Harrison's distinctive handwriting, read, "TB asking questions about night shipments. Need to handle situation before it becomes problem." Morrison stared at the note for a long time, feeling the weight of 21 years of unanswered questions suddenly shifting toward a terrible possibility that no one had ever seriously considered. Tommy Brennan hadn't wandered off into the wilderness, or chosen to start a new life somewhere else. He had stumbled onto a criminal enterprise, and his questions had made him a threat that needed to be eliminated. The sheriff drove immediately to Dorothy Brennan's house, the file folder clutched in her hands like evidence of a miracle. She found the old woman working in her garden, pulling weeds from around the roses that had been Tommy's favorite flowers. "Mrs. Brennan, I need you to sit down. I have something to show you." Dorothy looked at the sheriff's face, and knew immediately that whatever she was about to hear would change everything. She lowered herself slowly onto the porch steps, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Morrison explained what she had found, reading portions of the documents aloud, and showing Dorothy the handwritten note that seemed to confirm their worst fears. When she finished, Dorothy sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the implications of what she had just learned. "Walt Harrison," she said finally. "He came to Tommy's funeral service. He spoke about what a good worker Tommy was, how much everyone at the mill missed him. Did Tommy ever mention anything to you about problems at work? Anything that bothered him about the way things were being run?" Dorothy shook her head slowly. "Tommy never brought work troubles home. He said the mill was his responsibility, and home was his rest. But now that I think about it, he had seemed a little distracted those last few weeks, like something was on his mind." Morrison spent the rest of that afternoon on the telephone, contacting state and federal agencies that might have jurisdiction over a 21-year-old murder case. The response was mixed. Some officials expressed interest in reopening the investigation, while others questioned whether enough evidence existed to justify the expense and effort. But one phone call changed everything. A detective with the Oregon State Police named Robert Crane had been working cold cases for 15 years, and he remembered the Tommy Brennan disappearance from his early days on the force. When Morrison described what she had found in the mill basement, Crane's interest was immediately engaged. "Sheriff Morrison, I'm going to drive down there tomorrow morning. Don't touch anything else in that basement, and don't talk to anyone about what you found until I get there." Crane arrived in Millfield the next day with a team of evidence technicians and a search warrant for the entire mill property. What they found in the basement went far beyond the documents Morrison had discovered. Hidden behind a false wall, the technicians uncovered a second cache of records that detailed the illegal lumber operation in much greater detail. The scheme had been larger than anyone had imagined, involving not just unauthorized sales of mill lumber, but also the theft of timber from federal lands and the falsification of shipping records to hide the extent of the operation. The three partners, Harrison, a truck driver named Carl Jennings, and a lumber broker from Eugene named Frank Delacroix, had been stealing and selling thousands of dollars worth of lumber every month. But the most significant discovery was a partial confession written by Carl Jennings and dated 1975, 6 years after Tommy's disappearance. The document had apparently been intended as insurance against his partners, describing in detail how the three men had confronted Tommy Brennan on the morning of October 16, 1969. According to Jennings' account, Tommy had arrived at the mill early that morning, intending to examine the shipping records before his shift began. He had encountered Harrison in the office and had asked direct questions about the discrepancies he had noticed. When Harrison couldn't provide satisfactory answers, Tommy had threatened to contact the company's regional office to report his concerns. The confrontation had escalated quickly. Harrison had called Jennings and Delacroix, and the three men had decided that Tommy represented too great a threat to their operation to be allowed to live. They had forced him into Jennings' truck and driven him to a remote location in the mountains, where they had killed him and buried his body. The confession ended abruptly, with no indication of the exact location where Tommy's remains might be found. But Detective Crane knew that Jennings might still be alive, and that finding him could finally provide the answers that Dorothy Brennan had been waiting for since 1969. The search for Carl Jennings took 3 weeks. He had left Millfield shortly after the mill closed in 1987, and had been living under an assumed name in a small town in eastern Washington. When state police officers knocked on his door on a cold November morning, Jennings was 73 years old and suffering from emphysema that had left him weak and housebound. The confession came easier than anyone had expected. Jennings seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth about what had happened to Tommy Brennan. Sitting in an interview room at the Washington State Police Barracks, with an oxygen tank beside his chair and a court-appointed lawyer taking notes, he told the story that had been buried for more than 2 decades. "We never meant for it to go that far," he wheezed, his voice barely audible above the sound of his labored breathing. "Walt said we just needed to scare him, make him understand that keeping quiet was in his best interest. But Tommy wasn't the kind of man who could be scared or bought." According to Jennings, the three men had driven Tommy deep into the Cascade Mountains, to an area where logging roads ended and wilderness began. They had tried to convince him to forget what he had seen, offering him money and even a partnership in their operation. But Tommy had refused, insisting that what they were doing was wrong and that he couldn't be part of covering it up. He kept talking about his mother, about how she had raised him to do the right thing, said he couldn't look her in the eye if he helped us steal from the company that had given him a job and treated him fairly. The argument had continued for hours, with the three older men growing increasingly desperate, and Tommy remaining steadfast in his refusal to cooperate. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set, Harrison had lost his temper and struck Tommy with a piece of firewood they had brought for their campfire. "It wasn't supposed to kill him," Jennings said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But Tommy went down and didn't get back up. We checked for a pulse, for breathing, for any sign of life. There was nothing. The three men had buried Tommy's body in a shallow grave beside a creek that ran through a valley so remote that it appeared on no maps and was known only to hunters and loggers who had worked the area for decades. They had scattered rocks over the grave and covered it with fallen logs, making it look like natural forest debris. We told ourselves it was an accident," Jennings continued, "that we never intended for anyone to get hurt. But the truth is, we were scared of going to prison, and we chose to save ourselves instead of doing right by that boy and his mother." Detective Crane asked the question that everyone needed answered. Can you find the location again? Jennings nodded slowly. I've been there in my dreams every night for 21 years. I could find it even if I was blind. The expedition to find Tommy Brennan's grave took place on a grey December morning in 1990, when the first snow of winter had already begun to dust the peaks of the Cascade Mountains. Carl Jennings sat in the passenger seat of Detective Crane's four-wheel drive vehicle, an oxygen mask covering his face, and a map spread across his lap that he had drawn from memory during the long nights following his confession. Behind them followed a convoy of vehicles carrying forensic specialists, search and rescue personnel, and Sheriff Morrison, who had insisted on being present when Tommy's body was finally recovered. Dorothy Brennan had wanted to come as well, but her doctor and friends had convinced her that the physical demands of the search would be too much for a 74-year-old woman who had already endured more than any mother should have to bear. The drive took them deep into the Cascade National Forest, along logging roads that had been abandoned for years and were now barely passable, even with specialized vehicles. Jennings directed them through a maze of turns and intersections, his memory surprisingly sharp, despite the passage of more than 2 decades. It should be just ahead, he wheezed, pointing toward a narrow valley where a creek ran between stands of old-growth fir. We parked the truck up on that ridge and walked down into the valley, carrying Tommy. The search team spent 3 hours combing the area Jennings had indicated, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to look for any disturbance in the forest floor. The work was methodical and exhausting, complicated by 21 years of forest growth and the natural processes that had covered and recovered the landscape countless times. It was Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a forensic anthropologist from Portland State University, who finally located what they were looking for. Her trained eye noticed a slight depression in the ground near the creek, surrounded by trees that seemed younger than those in the surrounding area. Here, she called, marking the spot with a small flag. The vegetation pattern is different, and the soil composition looks like it's been disturbed and allowed to settle. The excavation began immediately, with Dr. Hendricks and her team working with the careful precision of archaeologists. Every shovelful of dirt was sifted through screens. Every potential piece of evidence was photographed and catalogued before being removed from the site. 4 feet down, they found the first piece of fabric, a scrap of blue denim that matched the description of the jeans Tommy had been wearing when he disappeared. 6 inches deeper, Dr. Hendricks' brush revealed the unmistakable curve of a human skull. Carl Jennings began to cry when the skull was uncovered, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from 21 years of suppressed guilt. Detective Crane sat beside him on a fallen log, making notes in his case file while trying to maintain the professional detachment that had served him through 15 years of investigating the worst that human beings could do to each other. The recovery of Tammy's remains took the rest of the day. Dr. Hendricks worked with painstaking care, uncovering bones that told the story of a violent death, even after more than 2 decades in the ground. The skull showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma, confirming Jennings' account of how Tommy had died. Personal effects found with the body: a wallet with his driver's license, still legible, a wristwatch that had stopped at 6:47, work boots that matched the pair Dorothy had described him wearing, left no doubt about the identity of the remains. Detective Crane made the phone call to Dorothy Brennan from the Forest Service station, where the team had gathered to process the evidence. The connection was poor, filled with static that seemed to emphasize the distance between the remote mountain location and the small house on Pine Street, where an old woman had waited for this moment for more than half her lifetime. Mrs. Brennan, we found him. We found Tommy. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Crane wondered if the connection had been lost. When Dorothy finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Is he... Can you tell if he suffered? Crane looked across the room at Dr. Hendricks, who was examining the skull under a portable light. The forensic anthropologist met his eyes and shook her head slightly, indicating that death had probably been instantaneous. No, Mrs. Brennan, Dr. Hendricks believes he wouldn't have suffered. It would have been very quick. Another long silence, and then, thank you, detective. Thank you for bringing my boy home. The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed, considering how cold the case had been for so many years. Carl Jennings' confession, combined with the physical evidence recovered from the grave and the documents found in the mill basement, provided prosecutors with a clear picture of what had happened to Tommy Brennan. Walt Harrison, now 78, and living in a retirement community in Arizona, was arrested 3 days after Tommy's body was recovered. Unlike Jennings, Harrison maintained his innocence, claiming that he had left Millfield shortly after the mill closed and had no knowledge of any illegal activities or violence. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Handwriting analysis confirmed that he had written the note about Tommy asking questions. Financial records subpoenaed from banks in 3 states showed deposits that matched the amounts recorded in the illegal lumber operations ledgers. Most damaging of all, Jennings provided detailed testimony about Harrison's role in planning and carrying out Tommy's murder. Frank Delacroix, the third member of the conspiracy, had died in a car accident in 1983, taking his secrets with him to the grave. But investigators were able to trace his involvement through the same financial records that had implicated Harrison, and his widow confirmed that he had left Oregon suddenly in late 1969, claiming that business opportunities in California required his immediate attention. The trial of Walt Harrison began in September 1991, almost exactly 22 years after Tommy Brennan's murder. The case attracted national attention, partly because of the long delay between the crime and the investigation, but mostly because of the human story at its center: a young man killed for trying to do the right thing, and a mother who had never stopped believing that the truth would eventually emerge. Dorothy Brennan attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row with Sarah Chen beside her, and a small photograph of Tommy in her hands. She listened to Carl Jennings describe her son's final hours, heard the forensic testimony about how he had died, and watched Walt Harrison sit impassively at the defense table, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with him. The most difficult moment came when Detective Crane read aloud from Tommy's personnel file, including performance evaluations that described him as honest, reliable, and the kind of employee who makes other workers want to do better. Dorothy closed her eyes during this testimony, remembering the young man who had kissed her cheek every morning before work and had never failed to call if he was going to be late coming home. Carl Jennings testified for 3 days, his failing health requiring frequent breaks and medical attention. His account of the murder was detailed and consistent, and his obvious remorse seemed genuine to everyone in the courtroom except Harrison's defense attorney, who argued that Jennings was trying to reduce his own culpability by exaggerating Harrison's role in the crime. But the jury found Jennings' testimony credible, particularly when it was corroborated by the physical evidence and the documents found at the mill. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, they returned a verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. Walt Harrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Carl Jennings, whose cooperation with the investigation and obvious ill health were considered mitigating factors, received a sentence of 25 years to life, though his doctors predicted that his emphysema would likely claim his life long before he became eligible for parole. Dorothy Brennan spoke at Harrison's sentencing hearing, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was facing, her first opportunity to directly address the man who had killed her son. "Mr. Harrison, I don't hate you," she began, her words carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I'm too tired and too old for hate, but I want you to know that Tommy trusted you. He looked up to you as a supervisor and respected you as a man. When he discovered what you were doing, he planned to talk to you about it privately, hoping you would explain or fix whatever was wrong." She paused, looking directly at Harrison for the first time since the trial began. "Instead, you killed him. You took my son away from me and left me to wonder for 22 years what had happened to him. You came to his memorial service and shook my hand and told me how sorry you were for my loss, all the while knowing that you were responsible for that loss." Harrison stared at his hands throughout Dorothy's statement, never raising his eyes to meet hers. When she finished speaking, he remained silent, offering no apology or expression of remorse. "The court accepts the jury's recommendation," Judge Patricia Holbrook said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Walter Harrison, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Tommy Brennan was buried on a clear October day in 1991, 22 years after his death, and 2 years after his body was finally recovered from its lonely grave in the mountains. The funeral service was held at the same Methodist church where the memorial service had taken place in 1969, but the congregation was much smaller now. Many of Tommy's contemporaries had moved away from Millfield, and some of the older residents who had known him had died during the intervening years. Dorothy had chosen a gravesite next to her husband's plot in the Millfield Cemetery. under an oak tree that provided shade in summer and had been one of Tommy's favorite climbing spots as a child. The headstone was simple granite, with an inscription that read, Thomas Patrick Brennan, 1943, 1969, beloved son, finally home. Sarah Chen spoke at the service, her voice breaking as she remembered the young man who had been working up the courage to ask her to dance. Tommy was the kind of person who made everyone around him want to be better, she said. He believed that right was right and wrong was wrong, and he was willing to pay the ultimate price for that belief. Frank Morrison, now retired from the hardware store his family had run for 40 years, served as one of the pallbearers. Tommy would have been a good husband and father, he said afterward. He would have been the kind of man this community needed to survive and thrive. In a way, his death marked the beginning of everything that went wrong for Millfield. After the burial, Dorothy returned to her house on Pine Street and found it strangely quiet. For 22 years, her life had been organized around the mystery of Tommy's disappearance, the waiting, the hoping, the small rituals that had kept his memory alive. Now that the mystery was solved and Tommy was finally at rest, she found herself unsure of how to spend the days that remained to her. But the resolution of Tommy's case had an unexpected consequence. Dorothy began receiving letters from families across the country who were dealing with their own unsolved disappearances. The publicity surrounding the trial had made Tommy's story widely known, and his case had become a symbol of hope for people who had been waiting for answers about their own missing loved ones. Dorothy answered every letter personally, offering comfort and encouragement to parents and siblings and spouses who were living with the same uncertainty that had defined her life for more than 2 decades. She shared what she had learned about patience and faith, and the importance of never giving up hope, even when that hope seemed foolish to everyone else. In 1993, Dorothy established the Thomas Brennan Foundation, a small non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for better resources for cold case investigation. The foundation operated out of her kitchen table, with Dorothy handling correspondence and a small group of volunteers helping with fundraising and awareness campaigns. Carl Jennings died in prison in 1994, 3 years after his conviction and 2 weeks before he would have become eligible for his first parole hearing. He had continued to cooperate with investigators until the end, providing information about other unsolved crimes that might have been connected to the illegal lumber operation. His final letter, dictated to a prison chaplain and sent to Dorothy Brennan, contained a simple message: "I'm sorry." Walt Harrison remained in prison, serving his life sentence in a medium security facility in Central Oregon. He never appealed his conviction and rarely received visitors. According to prison records, he spent most of his time in the library, reading books about forestry and logging history, as if trying to remember a time when his knowledge of the timber industry had been used for legitimate purposes, rather than criminal ones. Dorothy Brennan died peacefully in her sleep in January 1999, 30 years after Tommy's disappearance, and 8 years after his body was finally laid to rest. She was found by a neighbor who had come to check on her after she failed to appear for Sunday church services. On her nightstand was a photograph of Tommy taken just weeks before his death, showing him standing beside his pickup truck with the mountains of Oregon rising behind him. The Thomas Brennan Foundation continued operating after Dorothy's death, managed by Sarah Chen and a board of directors that included several other families who had been touched by similar tragedies. The Foundation's annual report noted that it had helped more than 200 families navigate the complex systems involved in missing person investigations, and had provided financial assistance for private investigators and forensic specialists in dozens of cold cases. In 2009, 40 years after Tommy Brennan's disappearance, the town of Millfield dedicated a small memorial park in his honor. The park was built on the site where Henderson's General Store had once stood, and featured a bronze plaque that told the story of a young man who had died for trying to do the right thing. The dedication ceremony was attended by fewer than 50 people. Millfield's population had dwindled to less than 200, and many of the attendees were visitors who had driven from other parts of Oregon to pay their respects. Sarah Chen, now a grandmother herself, spoke about the importance of remembering Tommy's story and the lessons it contained about courage and integrity. Tommy Brennan was 26 years old when he died, she said, standing beside the memorial plaque as autumn wind scattered leaves around her feet. He was just beginning to build the life he wanted, just starting to imagine the future he might have. But in the brief time he had, He showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when doing so requires great personal sacrifice. The memorial park also featured a bench where visitors could sit and reflect, and a small garden where Dorothy's favorite roses bloomed each spring. A sign near the entrance read, "In memory of all those who have vanished without explanation, and in honor of the families who never stop searching for answers." As the years passed, Tommy Brennan's story became part of the larger narrative about unsolved crimes in the Pacific Northwest. His case was featured in books about cold case investigations, television documentaries about missing persons, and academic studies about the social impact of unresolved violent crimes. But for those who had known him personally, Tommy remained more than a case study or a symbol. He was the young man who had fixed his mother's porch, who had been too shy to ask a girl to dance, who had worked honestly at a job he took pride in, and who had died because he couldn't bring himself to be part of something dishonest. The lumber mill where Tommy had worked was finally demolished in 2010, its buildings reduced to rubble and hauled away to make room for the vacation homes that developers had been planning for 20 years. But before the demolition began, Sarah, Chen, and several other members of the Thomas Brennan Foundation toured the site one final time, standing in the empty office where Tommy had discovered the evidence that would cost him his life. He would have been 67 this, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the abandoned building. He might have been a grandfather, might have spent his retirement fishing in these same mountains where he died. The basement where Detective Crane had found the crucial documents was filled with concrete before the demolition, sealing away the space that had held the secrets of Tommy's murder for more than 20 years. But the truth those documents had revealed could not be buried again, and the story they told continued to resonate with people who understood that some fights are worth having, regardless of the personal cost. In the end, Tommy Brennan's legacy was not defined by how he died, but by how he lived with honesty, integrity, and a simple faith that doing the right thing mattered more than personal safety or convenience. His story became a reminder that ordinary people facing ordinary decisions can choose to be extraordinary, and that such choices echo far beyond the moment when they are made. Sometimes, the truth survives longer than those who try to bury it. Sometimes, justice arrives decades late, but still arrives. And sometimes, the love of a mother and the persistence of those who refuse to forget can bring light to the darkest corners of human cruelty and restore the dignity that was stolen from both the dead and the living.